welcome everybody to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast series here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Blazer, and we have another indie developer cast lined up today. My guest is the creator behind the RPG Maker game Ozimi and the Pulsating Mass, a very not at all disturbing or dark RPG that came out during the last decade. And they are currently working on the Kickstarter for their next game, Hymn to the Earless God. And they're on to talk about both Ozimi, him, and kind of what it's like to work in RPG Maker as well. So please welcome from Starseed Games, Kasey Ozymy. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Josh. Thanks for having me on.
Yep, it is a pleasure to have you on, and I think I butchered your last name there, and I do apologize for that.
You were way closer than most people. It's pronounced Ozimi.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that one of us was able to get it right, at least for the cast. But thank you again for reaching out to me. Kasey and I have been talking about setting this up for a while, and we are finally get all of our schedules and such aligned. And it is an absolute pleasure to chat with you today.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Mm-hmm. And as I always say for these casts, if you're watching this right now and you are a developer working on an upcoming or released game and would like to come on and chat about it, please reach out. I am always looking for guests. So, to get the ball rolling, since this is your first time on the cast, Kasey, could you talk a little bit about kind of what your game dev background is? And for people who haven't heard of Ozimi before, what's kind of the elevator pitch for it?
Okay, well, so my game dev past, I'm kind of the indiest of indies, which is I kind of honed my teeth on the in the RPG Maker scene. Just make it. I had a background more in writing and music than in game dev, and I always was a big fan of RPGs, and I always kind of wanted to go sort of into this career, and I just did it by making hobbyist RPGs for a little bit, and I segued into Ozimi when I decided I was like I think I could give it a go, and so I spent a solid 4.5 years to 5 years working on it, and it reached a level of cult success. So it's been enough to support me for the past few years. But yeah, that's basically my game dev history. The elevator pitch for Ozimi, it's about an 8-year-old boy and his dreams, and you're exploring his dreams and consequently his nightmares. And it's about a lot of stuff, but I would say some of the key themes might be more about him about escapism and empathy. I would say are the two sort of touchstones for it.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, with Ozimi, you work in RPG Maker, and for him, is that also RPG Maker, or is that a different engine?
Him is a different engine. Luckily, we avoided the whole Unity fiasco, and we're going with Game Maker. So everything's been made in Game Maker so far, and it's been obviously more difficult than RPG Maker. It's a little bit less user friendly, but also way better in terms of what we can accomplish.
Mm-hmm. And for people watching this, we'll be talking a little bit more about the general design of Ozimi in this cast, but we are going to avoid spoilers and such for the story, so you won't have to worry about that much here. So, one thing that I really want to ask you about, Kasey, being a developer who grew and learned through RPG Maker. So the first thing is, for students, enthusiasts, and people watching this right now or listening, what was kind of your experience, first time getting the game dev and using RPG Maker as your engine?
So I started with RPG Maker actually a really long time ago, or I got my feet wet with it, I should say, on the PlayStation version of it. So that back when I was in high school, I'm how old am I? 39 now, 38, something like that. um, but yeah, like it's very user friendly. You know, I mean, you can if you, especially if you grew up with RPGs from the sort of like Super Nintendo era, NES era, where they're a bit more like tile based movement, that kind of thing. It to me it was all very intuitive to get into that, and there's not really programming involved, but there is sort of like programming logic involved. So you have to understand, or like have the capacity to learn things like loops and conditional statements, like some building blocks of code you're going to have to know. But it's done in such a way that it's really not too difficult. It wasn't too threatening, and it's if you get involved with there's a pretty healthy community of RPG Maker devs. So if you're going in there with like no experience, like you can learn a lot from them, and if you're going in there with some experience, you can learn a lot more that you can do with the engine that you may not have expected.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really good point that leads me to this next question I want to ask you. When we, from where I'm sitting as someone who's been covering video games in the game industry for now over a decade, when I was looking at games like 2010, 2011, that kind of period, it felt like a lot of people had a negative stigma against RPG Maker. I remember a lot of major developers saying, don't learn RPG Maker, go learn Unity. Which, of course, that fits really well with the news that's happening as we're talking about this right now.
Mm-hmm.
And what we began to see, though, over the course of the 2010s, with games like Jimmy, Lisa, To the Moon, Fear and Hunger, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot more because there have been a lot of RPG Maker games released, is that there's been, I think a general upswing or upwind in terms of people liking and using RPG Maker, or having it be a credible engine that you can build games around or build your own game dev around. And I want to ask you, as someone who has obviously been in that space and still is in that space, has that opinion shifted, or do other people feel that way?
Yeah, so I think part of what's made what's made RPG Maker just more viable as an engine is unfortunately not with the version I use, but in later versions, it's become much easier to port RPG Maker games to consoles. So now you see stuff like Omori, and it can just blow up. And there's something about RPG Maker too, where there were so many people that at least have dabbled in it, that when they see an RPG Maker game that's done really well, I think that they understand really that it's how much work went into it and how impressive that can actually be. But yeah, I mean, I do think there is still a stigma around RPG Maker games, but I think it is possible to break through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thank you for mentioning Omori, because I knew I'd forgotten one of the other ones that I did play too. I just couldn't think of it. And yeah, I think to that point, I think just like with any other game engines that we see, that there's always that difference between a game that just seems to, copy everything else that's been done before. We've seen this a lot with the quote-unquote shovelware era of stuff like Unity and Unreal. And then we have those games that really do something different. You can look at it, and it looks like nothing we haven't seen before. And there's been some fascinating games in the RPG Maker space that have done that. Beyond, again, an engine that has been traditionally meant just for making a standard 8-bit, 16-bit JRPG. And earlier this year, I had a chance to play Lisa the Definitive Edition for the first time, which I never had a chance to play the original. And again, it is a game built in RPG Maker, and while you can certainly see the trappings of that kind of design, it plays nothing like what we would consider a traditional RPG.
Yeah, I mean, I think that RPG, it's like designing, like, okay, so like turn-based RPGs in general, there's not like a lot has been done. It's a saturated genre, like, so I mean, I think it's really making an interesting RPG is, and a lot of it's just down to the details and like getting a lot of interesting details and things you wouldn't expect and subverting expectations. And I mean, you can do that with RPG Maker. You don't need to have a crazy interesting battle system to have nuance to a game. And I think probably there's more people exploring that kind of thing now than there were, back in like the 2K3 days when most people wanted to emulate Final Fantasy VII or something, right?
And with Jimmy, you say you worked on, well, you said I think 5 years, 5 to 7.
Yeah, it was 4.5 to 5, depending on when you start counting. Yeah.
And with like Jimmy and kind of trying to build that game up, and again, like we said, like you don't need to go into detail about spoilers of the story and such like that. But what was kind of like how did you want to kind of put your own mark on the turn-based RPG with Jimmy?
I mean, there were I would say the sort of like biggest high concept thing I was trying to do with Jimmy was marry the concept of like a Yume Nikki style exploration game with a JRPG, a turn-based JRPG. That was sort of like the large scale thing I think I did, hopefully successfully. The and like I was saying earlier, a lot of it comes down to the details. So with the a lot of the equipment, for instance, I wanted it to be like a huge. I just thought of it as like this big, like all the stuff you find, it's like a big toy box, and like when you find a new toy, it's not just like, hey, whatever, my attack goes up by 5 by equipping this weapon. It would be like a game. Like there's a lot of equipment in Jimmy that's just like totally game changing. So you'll find an equipment that's like, oh, this will stun enemies every time I use it. Or this is like a low attack weapon that makes me go first all the time. Like just these like big game changing things that let you build some kind of like like a build around equipment that you find. To me, that kind of thing is really fun and not something that I see enough of. Just other details like that. I made the agility really important, like within combat. Like there's actually you can there's a status effect called startle, so you can startle things, which is just a one turn stun, but you have to be faster than than your opponent. So I designed the whole battle system around that, where people will have like monsters will have these like turns, they'll take a turn to build up into a big attack, and it's just really prioritizing that kind of thing. I think is kind of sets Jimmy apart from a lot of the turn-based RPGs I've played. And yeah, like something else generally people really liked is I took the idea of stealing, and I made it really interesting. So instead of just stealing a piece of equipment or some item or money or whatever from monsters, you can steal things that change the course of combat, or they could you can steal concepts for instance. So there's an enemy in the in one of the earlier levels that you can steal their dignity. So that has gameplay significance when you do that. So yeah, that's I think those were kind of, I would say, like the larger things that I added that are things that I don't really see that often in RPGs or ever really with the steal mechanic.
And to go back to your earlier point about doing this in RPG Maker, like the RPG Maker like engine in of itself is not one that's like very complicated to learn or make this stuff like take a long time. As you said, it just really comes down to understanding the logic and then kind of building your game around those rules. Like some of the examples you mentioned in terms of a weapon that always lets you go first, it's a very interesting idea, and it doesn't sound like it would be like as hard to implement in a game that's already built around kind of like it's like attaching like properties or building properties around different weapons and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's definitely like a lot of the stuff isn't hard to implement in RPG Maker. Like,
Mm-hmm.
for the example we're talking about, it's just a piece of gear called the Rad Sneakers, and it just gives you like I think 300 extra agility. So it's like that's enough to put you ahead of everything, and it's just a number that you put into the database. It's not that's like not a difficult thing to set up. It's really just comes down to the ideas and design. Like most of them are pretty easy to implement. Something like the stealing isn't quite as easy to implement because it involves so RPG Maker, for those that are familiar, in a lot of the newer iterations you can they have what they just call scripts, which are just like little code snippets that you can add that alter the game engine's code. So with that, I found a snippet of code that allows for a stealing system, and then once I had that, I could work out the logic of how to do these more intricate things with it, which is a little bit more complex, but it's doable.
Mm-hmm. And with kind of like the movement and like exploration, how was that like being built in RPG Maker? You mentioned, of course, like kind of like the tile-based setup. So I imagine that would be like on the easier side to implement.
Right. Yeah, that's just out of the box. Like the first thing you can do when you get RPG Maker is I think like if you just put some tiles down that are walk onable, and then you hit the test play button, you can walk around on them. So actually, a lot of that stuff, that's what makes RPG Maker so accessible. Is a lot of the like really basic stuff is just in there.
Mm-hmm. And with like designing like the rules and actually let's talk about a little bit about the enemy encounters because you mentioned, of course, like building different enemy types and such like that. When we talk about turn-based RPGs, and especially in like the JRPG specific side of things, it's been like very much established in terms of like kinds of enemies you'll fight, kind of trying to make all kinds of minor enemies to like bosses and so on. What was it like? What was kind of like your thought process, or how did you want to design the enemies for Jimmy?
So I think there's a couple things that I considered, and I think probably should be considered for any kind of RPG that you're building. The first is like, what is the player's toolkit, and like how is it different?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're in a new area, has your toolkit changed? Because I think that enemies need to really reflect that. So, for instance, when you first get the ability to steal, it's important to have a lot of enemies that you can steal from and have interesting effects, from doing that to them. If you had this is our Jimmy didn't really have like classic element like an elemental weakness system, but I mean, if you have fire magic, if you just get fire magic, there needs to be something you can burn with that fire magic once you get it. Like you need to give the players a chance to like use their skills and see how fun they are, and then you can build on that as the game goes on. But I would say that's the first major thing is just mechanically you need to make sure that you're letting the player use their toolkit as they develop it. The other thing I try to do is build character out of the enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't like to the extent of something like Undertale, where you're giving like dialogue and stuff like that to your enemies. If you're doing like a standard, building off of sort of the standard RPG, turn-based RPG, which is what I like to do. I like to play off that. You just give those monsters just like little things that characterize them, and like how they attack and how strong they are and everything needs to be like needs to be baked into their stats. It needs to be baked into their move set. Like that gives a lot of a little bit more depth, to them as a for the player, I think.
Mm-hmm. And it also creates very interesting aspects when you're trying to balance enemy encounters, and especially when you're trying to do like boss fights as well, because we've seen a lot of RPGs where enemies and bosses just become. Wow, that's some good on that phone ringing. 1 second here. I don't know who that is, but okay. 3, 2, 1. And yeah, that's a good point about kind of like the enemy design and balance, because one of the things that we see from a lot of RPGs is that they can sometimes turn encounters into just basically stat fights. That whoever has the biggest numbers will win, and if you haven't been grinding and leveling up for the last few hours, bosses can either take a very long time or just be completely impossible to kill.
Yeah, that's definitely. I was playing through the original Breath of Fire on my phone a while back, and I had forgotten how bad that really could be, because that is literally every boss fight in that game, almost every just normal encounter is just a straight up damage race. I do There is something to that, and I think there's a backbone there that should be acknowledged, that RPGs are generally about this long form stat progression, and there is something to that is good, that when you as you being able to see the effects of your leveling, that is something that has worked in a lot of RPGs. I mean, obviously, I prefer when there's a bit more to it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, my the encounters I do, I feel I consider boss fights in RPGs to basically be like exams, like which is like kind of a lame way to pitch your game, but I mean, it's like you've been normal encounters are essentially you like taking a course. You're learning the ropes of the game. Boss encounters are when you test those. So again, like if you give someone a steel mechanic or fire magic or whatever, that boss needs to really test like your understanding of all the concepts that you've taught prior to that. So if you've been teaching what the steel mechanic can do, you better be able to steal lots of shit from that boss. Like that is the kind of thing that really I think what sort of the guiding light for designing a boss, and then like obviously having lots of little complexities. And something else that I've been doing, especially with my the game I've been working on, is since boss fights are generally prolonged, I like to have some kind of like stakes change as the fight progresses. Something that just amps up, instead of just being like, okay, I found the pattern, I'm going to do it over and over again and win. Something that breaks that pattern, or just even just like straight up like something that'll slowly buff the boss's stats over time. Just something to create like a sense of oh shit, this guy's harder than I expected, to happen, as the fight progresses.
Mm-hmm. And that always adds like to, as you said, like the thematic aspects of these enemies, when something will change during the middle of the fight, and kind of throws the player for a loop like that.
Yeah, I mean that's the idea, right? Is that you don't get them used to just being like, well, I would say like just a general criticism that a lot of people have with RPGs, which is valid, is that you're like, okay, well, I have the best move, I'm going to use it every time, and that's it. And being able to like have ways to make it to where they just can't straight up do that, or if they have like a specific tactic, it's like, yeah, it's like maybe that will work well a lot of the time, but it's not going to always work well. Like being able to use the full toolkit instead of just parts of it, to me, is like a goal as a designer.
Mm-hmm. And also lets you do more interesting things with the skills and mechanics when they can actually work with the bosses. Because, like, we're talking about like long-term complaints about RPG design. One of the oldest, especially for JRPGs, has been, here's 27 different stat modifiers and debuffs, and the bosses are immune to every single one of them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So good luck.
Yeah, I hate that. I make sure to design all my status effects to where they will work on bosses. Like it's crazy to me that you are given like a toolkit and then it's just immediately like, well, it doesn't work. Like it's okay if it doesn't work as well if you do things to limit it and you make that clear through the fight.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's definitely a bummer to invest all of your skill points or whatever into like a poison build and then just have it straight up just not work.
Yep. And it just really becomes painful like that for a lot of these games. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about in terms of like from your own like sense of RPG design is definitely like the structure of difficulty in these games. Like some of the games that I mentioned earlier, stuff like Fear and Hunger, Lisa, they are both on the challenging side. Fear and Hunger, I would probably say, is one of the harder RPGs I've had a chance to play. And we've seen kind of like when it comes to like the structure of an RPG, two very distinct ways of building them. One is the kind of just throw the player to the wolves, you take 3 steps in the wrong direction, bam, you're dead. Or the very, very slow build-up of, as everyone knows, the infamous phrase, the real game begins at X, and that could be 5, 10, 15 hours down the line. With, like, the pacing of Jimmy and what you're trying to do with him, like, what is, like, your approach to, like, how quickly you want the player to get into things, but at the same time make sure they understand what is going on with the combat?
Right. I would say of those two, I mean, it depends on, like, and speaking generally, I think it just depends on, like, what your game is, like, trying to do, like, thematically. Mm-hmm. So, like, Fear and Hunger, that game is really about, you being up against this horrible place that you, like, are... The game's goal is to make you seem so small in comparison to that,
Mm-hmm.
So, in that case, I think it obviously makes total sense that it's like you go in there and it's like if you get your ass handed to you, that's just how it is, With Jimmy and with him, it's a little bit more of the other approach where I'm trying to have a bit more of a slow build, slow progression thing. I still like to have difficulty spikes. So with Jimmy, I would say, the first. I mean, we're avoiding spoilers, but I would say like I guess this would be the second real boss in that game is when there's a difficulty jump, and that's probably comes at about the 2-hour mark. So it's not like a 10-15, but I mean, I do think there needs to be sort of like a tutorial window where you're learning the ropes, which is like, that's a hard thing to balance because you're giving a lot of information to the player, and at the same time, there's people who've like, I've played RPGs before, With him, it's a bit more mixed because there are 4 different characters. So with the 4 main characters, like one of them, Sheer, is like her sort of role is that she is this sort of mantis samurai who is really powerful. So her early game is going to be kind of easy because because I have to show story-wise that she can absolutely crush everything. She's an apex predator. That's just where she's at. Meanwhile, and you can play this in the demo, Pox starts off very low on the totem pole. It's very easy to get. He gets kicked into this place called the Sludge Hole, which is basically just. For his race of beings, this is like their disposal area. Like this is where all of the defective, they're called Varric, the defective Varric are. So when he gets down there, he's at the bottom. So it's intentionally, very easy to get wiped out there. And we made it to where you can refight battles immediately. Like there's no wait time for that, and there's also an autosave feature. So we definitely were like, okay, we want this to be harder, but you can always reload. So it's sort of like I guess like a Super Meat Boy kind of approach to where it's like, okay, this is more difficult, but you don't have to wait long between tries. So yeah, it's him's a bit more of a mixed bag. The other 2 characters have varying levels of difficulty as well. But there's definitely going to be very difficult bosses in him, especially if we. One of the things that we're hoping to get done for the full release, but it depends on budget. we have different varying levels of difficulty. So we're actually going to try to put a difficulty system in that has different levers. So you might have like increased monster stats as one lever, and then one would be like monster behavior. So there's a lot of interesting little monster behaviors that we'd like to work in if we can. So that's the hope, at least. But the harder difficulty will be pretty brutal, is the goal.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point I want to ask you about, Kasey. When it comes to RPGs, like for people who are listening to us right now, they know that I will play games on the highest difficulty. I have played Doom Eternal, Turbo Overkill. Like, if it's an action-based game, I will play them on the absolute highest difficulty. When it comes to RPGs, however, I've learned from basically very painful experiences just that it becomes more and more annoying to play a lot of RPGs on the highest difficulty because it often comes down to just, again, raw stats. If on normal it takes, 5 turns to be an enemy, and on hard it takes 10 to 15 turns, then it's not like I'm really doing the game any differently. It's just that I'm more at the mercy of the abstraction. And I haven't really found too many RPGs that make it feel like a legitimate difference between playing on easy, normal, and hard. And as someone who, again, has a background, you've probably played a few RPGs yourself, I wanted to get your thoughts on trying to make the different difficulty settings, or as you said, the different difficulty levels, levers, I should say, feel like different and rewarding for the player.
Right. So, I mean, I think that the biggest sort of misstep that most RPG difficulty systems make is that they'll straight up do, buffs to stats, and that's it. So the worst one would be if you are like, okay, yeah, I'm going to double everyone's hit points. It's like, yeah, you have doubled the amount of time it takes to complete these encounters, and you're like, well, I'm doubling everyone's stats across the board, and it's like, okay, well, that's great. And you've doubled their defense and their health. That means you've quadrupled the amount of time it takes to beat the boss. Yeah, that's definitely, and that's something that we're going to avoid. Like, when I say buff monster stats, I would say this is mostly going to be, their attack stats and their speed and that kind of thing. And like I was saying earlier, I think that the biggest key to having a difficulty in an RPG, a turn-based RPG, at least in in a general sense, I think is to modify enemy behavior. It's an RPG is kind of about, like, as you start getting more difficult and you get away from or more complex, and you start getting away from just like the basic, like we were saying earlier, the basic, just like you get stronger, you do more damage, you beat harder enemies, and it's about that progression. Like, once you get beyond that, you then go, well, what is turn-based combat? And if it's not, pattern recognition, learning what the enemy can do, learning, what you can do to compete with that. So by having like more difficult, more complex patterns, I feel like that's a way to increase the difficulty without it being gimmicky. That's because, I would say that the two difficulty things I run into are like, one, just like stat increases, like I mentioned earlier, and two, just making it tuned so tightly that that it just becomes this like, practice of banging your head against the wall over and over. I've seen some I don't know how many ROM hacks you've played. I've seen some ROM hacks that's what they go for, is, it's like, okay, well, this I was playing a Final Fantasy IV ROM hack that did this, where it just had I think it was like the Bahamut fight, and they just made it to where he would it was a weird damage raise with an active time bar, where it's like you had to do very specific things at very specific timing windows, and if you didn't, it was over. And that's just not that fun either. So, but yeah, I mean, I think the key is, at least from my perspective, is to just make a more intricate pattern, that sort of defies expectations for what people have experienced in the sort of easier difficulties.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, I've seen a few like Kaizo or like super difficulty ROM
Hmm.
hacks. I know they did a big one for Super Mario RPG. I think it was released like a few years ago. And I was like watching like people cover that one, and it can get very crazy, especially when like fans create like higher difficulty modes for some of their favorite games. It becomes a lot. I mean, that I just described the entire Kaizo market right
Right.
there.
Yeah, I did. Someone in a fan of Jimmy was actually working on a hard mode version, and I played, the like 2 hour bit that he had made sort of on a stream as like it was like a Jimmy anniversary kind of thing, and yeah, it was difficult. Like it's not. I gotta say, it's a little embarrassing to like fail at your own game over and over again.
One other question that I wanted to ask you about, like, go back to a point you were saying earlier, especially with him, about designing a character that's supposed to be like weak or trying to build like these themes in the mechanics. This is something that again, like it's a very interesting that you can really do with RPG design, being able to abstract things out, but it can also, I think, in a way, make a game a little bit more annoying for new players. Like when you build a character who, let's say, purposely starts out like as a brief, I guess, spoiler for him. When you start out in the demo with that character, he's going. I think he loses his arm and his eye, so
Mhm.
he's not exactly going to be the best fighter. And as you said, like the setting and the basic challenge of the demo is around this. You're not playing as a battle-hardened warrior. You're playing as someone who is barely alive. And I wanted to ask you about, in terms of building that experience, how do you kind of balance between the fact that the whole point of this is that this character is supposed to be weak, barely alive, can't really do much, with the fact that you're building an RPG. You're trying to make this as a game that people want to like build this character. They want to, play it and make progress. Because it's always simple, I think, balance those two extremes out.
Right. Yeah. Like. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to. I feel like you should give players little victories. So, like, Pox may be weak, but there are weaker monsters still that are
Mm-hmm.
dying in that area, and you can take them out. Like there's I designed one enemy. It's called an unwanted, for instance, and it starts bleeding. Like it starts the fight and it's bleeding. So it won't quite bleed out entirely if you just sat there and defended, but every turn it loses health, and so it's like it's just a sitting duck. It's for you to kill and eat,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. So you give players that you give them a way. There's a path, but there's also these needs to be clear reminders that you're not that tough, and with those being impossible encounters and encounters that are difficult, peppered in. To me, it's just a balancing act. It's like any it's if you start the game as someone who is super powerful, I mean, it's the same thing. You're going to have to give players some kind of um, challenge at some point, but like it's just a stat game. It's just about balancing and making it feel both uh, like you are that character as you're playing them, and that it is which is at some level is fun. Like it's kind of fun being like the scrappy underdog, and having and like getting those little victories and like kind of building up, and that ties into the story. So like I think it's really just a numbers game when it comes down to it.
Mm-hmm. And a few of like my friends, like we were talking about like game ideas, like one of them was to make a game where you're kind of like being depowered, like you're getting
Mm.
weaker through like design mechanics, and that could also like fit with an RPG theme. But as we've said,
Mm-hmm.
like it's always tricky to like balance these things out, because at the end of the day, if the game isn't at least entertaining to the player, they're not going to stick around. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious, like one of the things I find very interesting, like especially like the RPG maker scene, is how much buzz like Fear and Hunger has gotten in like the last like year or two, with people finding out like, hey, there's this incredibly brutally difficult game where at any time you can just be killed by a random enemy. And like we've said, like, and to go back to our earlier point about like Kaizo mods and Kaizo hacks, there is an audience of people who will want to play a game at the absolute highest level. They'll make it even harder if they can. And I think part of like the challenge is again trying to make a game that, yes, it can appeal to that audience, but you still want to have like, you know, a lifeline for people who are new to at least try and get in and understand what's going on.
Yeah, Fear and Hunger's success, I think, is at least due in part to, and also this also ties into like, Dark Souls, right? Like Dark Souls exploded, is how easy games got. Because it's like, if you go back to NES era, everything was hard as shit. Like they were very like, they made short games that you had to play over and over and over again to master, because you can only fit so much on that cart. As games progressed, I feel like they tended to get easier to appeal to more people, and by doing that, you kind of pushed out a lot of gamers who felt like who felt that challenge missing, and Dark Souls really, fed that finally, and I think that's why Dark Souls was so successful, and consequently why Fear and Hunger is it's like, okay, this is just like unexplored territory, and it's hard and unforgiving, and that's just part of the design, and that's fine, which is like super cool to see, that kind of thing. Also, I wanted to mention you had said earlier that you were talking about making a design where the character gets weaker. I've done that. I had a little contest RPG that I made that did that, where you had a clay golem in your party who starts out and or a mud golem, I guess, who starts out and is like the big tank, and like, there's sort of like no issues with combat at that stage. But after every combat, he loses a little bit of his mud, so his health pool gets lower after every combat, and nobody else levels. It's more about like you then you'll see a treasure chest, and you'll have to determine, it's like, do I want that? And set it, there might be an enemy in front of it, right? So well, I could fight that encounter, but my tank would get worse. But then I would have this equipment that makes everyone else better. That's how I balanced it. Was I had this, by the end of the game, it's like your tank was almost useless if you had fought every encounter, but your other characters had gotten so much stronger that they kind of make up for it. So I built it thematically around that. I don't know how successful it was, but yeah, so that is something that I've definitely toyed with. I thought it was interesting what you said.
And one other point, before I forget to mention this, I was saying about this when we were talking about the difficulty settings. I did enjoy from Lisa what they did with like their hard mode, where they introduced like harder enemy fights. I'm not so sure if I like the fact they limited your saves, but it felt like a legitimate way of making the game harder, rather than again just saying every enemy just does 50 times more damage to you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that fits in with the design of Lisa a lot. I actually haven't played Lisa, which I've missed a lot of games because I focus on game dev, and then, but from what I've seen from Lisa, it appears like, it's a post-apocalyptic setting, that sort of like survival mindset, and having like a limited amount of items. I think, from what I understand, like items are super important in it. And then, like, having to sort of face the consequences of those decisions of using or not using those items. I think that does work pretty well. I don't know if they had what would you call it? A quick save option in it at all?
No.
That I think that I would have put that in there because sometimes you just can't play, and sometimes something comes up and you gotta save out, and being able to quick save, I think, would probably be a good addition to that wouldn't compromise the integrity of the system that they set up. But also, it was an RPG Maker. There's not a quick save option easily available, and so that would require some hard coding to get right. So I do understand why that might not be in the game, but that might be a little tweak I would put in.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I do want to spend some more time talking about him. With regards to Jimmy, is there anything else you would like to mention about like the design or development that we haven't touched on?
Not really. I mean, I would just say, just in general, like it was a game that I did myself. Like, I didn't really have I used a little bit of like code snippets that I got online, and my friend Jason, who's working with me on him now, did like the coding to get the like battle backgrounds to work correctly. So it's like I'm not saying I did this. I was an island on this, but basically, everything that was drawn in the game, all of the music in the game, all of the writing, and what occurs on screen, it was all done by one person. So that is definitely something that you can, like making a game like that is something that you totally can do. It just takes time to learn those skills. Just wanted to throw that out there.
So that let's talk a little bit more about him. As we are recording this right now, you are kind of at the tail end of the Kickstarter for it. And for people watching or listening to us right now, be sure to go and check it out. There'll be a link to that in the description down below. So with him, we've been talking a little bit about here and there. So for people listening to us, what is kind of like the major aspects, or what are you doing differently with him compared to Jimmy?
So I would say, like on a conceptual level, Jimmy is really about like an 8-year-old boy that's very empathetic, and this is basically the exact opposite. Like, it is a game about creatures with little to no empathy, and it's on it's on an alien world. It's very, very stark, and so it's, and all the design sort of complements that. So it's just a way different setting. I wanted to go way different with this one. For those of you that are like familiar with the Linus series, or it's called Paladin's Quest. The first one was called Paladin's Quest in America. That's sort of what I'm drawing from having this like weird alien world. But it's definitely, we took that idea and we took it further as far as we could. So I would say, like, conceptually, that's they're almost total opposites. The main things we got to do design wise that were different were in a lot of mostly thanks to the change in engine. So we're using Game Maker now instead of RPG Maker, so that opened up just a lot of options. Now instead of tile based movement, it's pixel movement. So it's much more like Chrono Trigger, in that you can run in whichever direction you want. And it's Chrono Trigger was another big inspiration. So in terms of like level design, so now with Jimmy, it was a bit more I would say almost Metroidvania style, where you'd get a new ability and you could return to areas, and and that sort of influenced a lot of the design. With him, it's more like Chrono Trigger, where we got to have these on-map encounters. So it's a lot about more about like designing levels to show these enemies inside of these levels, and they had their own behaviors and stuff, and own patterns. So there's like Chrono Trigger, a lot of it's about like, okay, well, here are these encounters, how can I avoid them, is a lot of what goes through your mind as a player. So you can avoid most encounters in him. There are some forced encounters as well, but most of them you can avoid. So which opens it up to like speed running and stuff, if that's your kind of thing. But yeah, I would say that those are like the biggest design changes, were like those kinds of things. Also, like just because of the setting, because you're these weird insect creatures. The design kind of built around that, so this idea, like, they all lack empathy. So for the idea of like a shared inventory with like healing items is, we flip that on its head to where now you don't have a shared inventory. You only have you have a shared inventory, but you don't have like a shared potion inventory. So if you have healing potions, you can't use them on the other characters. Like they can only use them on themselves. With the only exception being if your character has an adaptation, which is basically just like a passive skill called empathy, which is very rare. So that is like the that idea that there are these selfish little creatures that you're playing sort of permeates everything in the design. Like another aspect of it is you can whenever an enemy dies on the field, they leave their corpse stays on the field, and you can just straight up eat them, and that gives you health and can sort of regenerate like a food meter that acts as like a storage tank for health that recovers you after combat. But yeah, all that just sort of stems from it's like you're these weird, selfish insect creatures. What would that world look like? And that's totally permeated every aspect of the design.
Now, earlier you mentioned you're building around, I think you said 4 different characters. Is the kind of structure of the game kind of like you have to play through each character's story to get the full picture? Or is like each character kind of like their own like self-contained like episode in this world?
So it's a little bit column A, column B on that. Like it's each character story is self-contained. However, the way the structure works is you have you play the first half of each story, and it's bottlenecks. So whenever you play the first half of one character story, that will have ramifications on what you can do on the other character stories. So generally what that means is you might open up like new areas that can also be explored by other characters, or open up new mercenaries that can join your party on other characters' games. And also, like if you were to like build up a mercenary on one player's game and then not take them with you, sort of in the final act of the first half, you can pick that mercenary up and all their early on in one of the other characters' games, and all their stats will be high. So you can kind of give yourself advantages and stuff that way. And then once it bottlenecks, you then it will create a separate save there, and you can play as one of the other 4 characters for the second half of the game. And this is again like totally self-contained. And once you finish that, it will take you back to that bottleneck, and you can play as the other characters if you want.
And as you said earlier, that like each character is also going to be like around like their own different personality, different skills, and so on too, right?
Right. Yeah. So, just like I mentioned Pox earlier, who is like he's the one that's missing the eye and the arm. He's way, and then Sheer, who is the samurai mantis. So it's like those are 2 extremes already. Another one is Capella, who to me is sort of like the sort of a standard RPG character, where she starts out as being okay, she's and she has some help early on, and then she's got a more traditional arc as a character. And then Flim, the 4th character, is like a thief. Like, so his early game is a bit more focused on like NPC interaction and stuff. So you can pickpocket from every NPC in the game with him, for instance. So that becomes he's a lot more different, a lot freer to like get totally loaded early on, right? Like, he can get a lot of money early on, a lot of equipment early on. And depending on how well you utilize that feature, you can get cranked out really easily with him. Or you could not, and, face dire consequences.
And in terms of kind of like, excuse me, the length that you're going for, like how long is like each individual like character story is?
So it's hard to say at this point, because we're so far out, But I would say that the goal is that each of these is essentially a full length RPG. So this is, why part of the reason why we need to go to Kickstarter is because there's just like a lot of assets that you need because of that. Because you have 4 separate stories that are each, probably going to be 30 to 40 hours. So that adds up. That's like about 160 hours of gameplay at the high end. That's what we're projecting. I don't know where that is, and also where that's going to land rather. And also, since I said, it was like a sort of a Chrono Trigger style overworld that you can very easily run past stuff. So it's like, I don't know, like how quick is a speed run of this game going to be? I don't know. Probably pretty brief.
And with the combat itself, we mentioned earlier about like being able to like devour enemies in the one campaign. Does like each character have like a unique ability, or does like the whole like eating the enemies or devouring them, is that like kind of persistent across the different characters?
It's pretty persistent. So there are some variances, but yeah, generally it's like almost everyone can eat corpses, other than people that have the vegetarian adaptation, who can't eat most corpses. But then there are plant-based enemies that you can eat that no one else can eat. So there's like some, that will matter more in some levels than others. There's also an adaptation that lets you get more out of corpses. So Pox has this. It's called Voracious Eater. So he gets more health from corpses. There's a one adaptation that lets you get other resources from corpses. And then there's other things you can do with corpses too. Like you don't just eat them, like or prevent enemies from eating them. If you poison a monster and it dies, the poison stays on the corpse. So then if you eat the corpse, you get poisoned. But the same applies to enemies that do it. And you can zombify corpses. There's a spell that lets you do that turns a corpse into a berserker for a few turns. There's an invincible berserker, I should say, for a few turns. And then there's a spell called Explosive Fungus. That's your basic like corpse explosion spell. So you can turn corpses into bombs. And there's a lot of boss fights that play on these kinds of things. So there's a lot of variance to it as the game progresses. But like I'd say, like the core concept is it's pretty similar across most characters.
And with some of the examples you just mentioned of like some of like the more unique spells, are they stuff that is like learnable for the characters, or do characters come with like specific spells or kind of builds, and you'll like decide who you take based on that?
It's a mix. So every character has access to techniques, or they're just called techs in the game. So those are character specific. So there's only 4 of them. The way I think of it is it's sort of like a Wild Arms-esque system where you build up technique points just as the battle progresses, and then it's sort of, or I guess it's kind of like a limit break too, where you build up this resource as the fight progresses, and there's different ways to get that resource depending on your build and stuff. The other thing you have are weapon mods that so it's like instead of changing your equipment, it's more of like a Suikoden-esque system where everyone has a set weapon, and then you have but you have mod points for it. So which is just like it's based on the level of the weapon. It goes up to 10. So if your weapon's level 10, you have 10 mod points, and every character has their own subset of weapon mods. So that's another way to sort of like each character is sort of like distinct in that way. And also the adaptations, they all have inherent adaptations, which are just passive abilities. Those are set as well. There are things you can do to get adaptations and stuff for your characters and additional weapon mods, but they're pretty limited and generally story based. The spells, however, are learnable by everyone, so everyone can learn every spell. Everyone has different learning rates, so there are certain magic types that are just more difficult to learn for other characters, and some that are very easy to learn for certain characters. But that's the biggest skill set right there. That's a 40 spells per character, and there is I should say there is one exception. There's 6 like schools of magic. 2 of them are exclusive to certain characters. But the 4 main schools that are your basic, like they're built around the environment. So magic of the trees, magic of the swamp, magic of the wasteland, and magic of the mountains. Those are all things you can learn on every character.
Okay. And one thing I was looking at on the store page is that you said that the different environments of the game will also impact like how spells will work or what they can do, right?
Yeah, and that's those 4 areas of magic that I pointed out. Yeah, if you are in a mountain field, which is sort of associated with ice, and you're using like wasteland magic, which is associated with like fire, your wasteland magic is going to be worse. It's going to hit worse. But if you're in a forest field, your wasteland magic is now because of the way I tried to get a logic behind it. So sort of how fire would react in a forest, would spread very quickly. So if you're using wasteland magic in a forest field, all of your single target abilities are now hitting everything at just like a little bit for less damage. So there are all these like trade-offs, for depending on which field you're in, and you also have the ability to change the field, which is another spell that you can learn.
All right. And with kind of like, as we were saying earlier with like Jimmy and designing like enemies and encounters of like escalation or make use of these mechanics, how does that approach work with him in terms of like the enemies and the encounters on that you're building?
Oh yeah, so that's something that is easier to do early game because early game you have a very limited skill set, and I'm giving players the option to get other forms of magic and stuff that could alter the game in various ways. But yeah, I mean, basically, as you progress, I kind of just expanded that. So early on, it might be something like there is if you have a character as a spear, for instance, they'll hit in a column instead of just in a single target. So I'll have enemy encounters that reflect that, and they also have an ability. A lot of them have a weapon mod called Spearfisher that does more damage on aquatic type monsters. So I'll make sure that those kinds of things are in. So early game, that kind of thing is super super easy to do. As you progress and you have access to all these other mercenaries, I mean, you start throwing the kitchen sink out there, right? Like you can start having these more complex encounters. Pretty quickly, really. Especially once you start getting into optional encounters. I start having a bit more. It's like, okay, well, you maybe if you have Magic of the Wasteland, this fight could go one way. That would be maybe easier, But if you're building in a different way, you're not locked out of that fight. You can still win it. It's just going to be more difficult. So I think that's pretty much what it comes down to is how you balance the fights. And also something I did with Jimmy and here is I had a lot of just optional content, right? Like, so a lot of optional levels with hard bosses, and they have fixed levels. So if you run into an encounter where you're just like, I'm not winning this anytime soon, you can just leave and come back later. And that design is still in Hymn to the Earless God.
And excuse me. And I always like it when games give you the option to run away. Like that was one thing that kind of annoys me about some RPGs where you get stuck in a fight and you can't win, and it's like, well, I guess I just lose. Like there's nothing more I can really do to get around it.
Yeah, and that's like you can run from almost every encounter in him. Like you can. The only penalty is like I was saying earlier, how the design of these selfish little creatures sort of like permeates everything. If you run away, you're only one of those characters runs away. The other ones are still in the field, so you have to run away with everyone, which means whoever's last is probably going to get beaten up a little bit. Yeah, like I wanted to make sure it's like, yeah, if you get in this encounter, you can escape. That's not really a problem. There's some exceptions to that, especially this is especially true on Pox's scenario because that whole level is so tuned. But yeah, you'll notice on Capella's scenario, I believe you can run away from almost everything, if not everything. So yeah, and because I mean, the only thing you really do, like, you're really doing with your player there is like, they're not going to be as strong. I mean, you're giving up on potential experience and that sort of that progress you get from that. So it's like if they want to do that, if you're a player who wants to have, it's like isn't interested in like fighting the lower level enemies and just wants the challenge of facing bosses. I mean, sure, we'll give you that option.
Mm-hmm. And with kind of like setting up like the world itself, like one thing I wanted to ask you about, for the world of him, is this based off of like an existing property, or is it something that you create like specifically for him?
So I mean, it was based off of, or I guess I should say, it was inspired by. I mentioned this earlier, the Linus series.
Okay.
And that's really more of like, we make nods to it, but like in terms of like the lore of the world and everything, it's entirely unique. It's just like that initial inspiration of like, oh, this is like, you know, a planet where everyone hates you. Like taking that idea and running with it is mainly what I pulled from Linus, and then some ideas from that too were just like sort of naturally. It's like, well, I have to include this. For instance, in the Linus series, almost all of your characters are mercenaries. Like you have to, because everyone hates you, so you have to pay them to work with you, and that just sort of naturally fit in this world. So I was like, okay, I have to include that, and but yeah, like in terms of the lore of the world and all of that, it is entirely unique.
All right. Let me see. Oh, and one other point to clarify for people watching or listening: are the encounters random or fixed on the field?
Oh, they're fixed. So, like I said, it's like Chrono Trigger, where
Mm-hmm.
they're you see them and you can choose. Generally, it's a choice. You can fight them if you want, or you can run around them. The You have an ability you can use on the field where you can swing your weapon. So you can also, if you run up to a monster and swing your weapon to it to trigger the encounter, you'll get an initiative bonus, and so you can start with, generally you'll outpace everyone when you do that. There isn't really like, so there's no real randomization, but I want to avoid just saying it's fixed in that it's not like, you are forced to fight encounters. It's nothing like that. Um, Generally, you can avoid most encounters.
All right. I don't think there is anything else. So, for as I said earlier, like for people watching us right now, you are in the tail end of the Kickstarter. In terms of like for people listening to us who haven't had a chance to check it out yet, what are like some of like the major goals or stretch goals that you're hoping to get if you are able to get funded through the Kickstarter?
Well, I mean, first off, we just want to get funded, and like at this point, we have about 8 days left, and we're about halfway there. So, we need a lot of support on this. But yeah, like the main, a lot of the stretch goals, the early stretch goals, are things that we really want to include in the game, and are going to try to include in the game, even if we don't hit the stretch goals. But we're just like, that'll be a way to sort of guarantee that we'll get them in. The first is, I mentioned the difficulty options. That's like the last thing that would be on the chopping block. Like, we really want those in, and we will probably get those in regardless. The second stretch goal is, or well, I don't know the order, but there's a new game plus option is something that we've been kicking around. So I would like to do that. A There is the one that I'd really like to get in is I would really like to have an end game super boss once you've completed all four of the storylines
Mm-hmm.
that lets you utilize all four of your parties in like one really big fight. Like, I'd really like to get that in. but that's more assets. The other things that are after that are really neat are the the mercenaries. So I basically have 4 mercenaries, potential mercenaries that I sort of came up with the ideas for, after I'd already designed everything, and they're characters that appear in the game already, so they're NPCs at this point. But I can they have really neat design concepts behind them. So like the one that I'm showing right now is named Grackle, and he's like he's basically like an assassin type character who like can hide in combat and then gets various bonuses when he's hidden. Like that's a concept that it's like I'd like to implement in. There's another I guess conceptually, like 2 of the characters are basically like a team, so all of their abilities like play off of the others. So I showed this a little in the demo. There's one ability that's like a combination ability between 2 characters. These guys, it's like that's their thing. So it's like all of their abilities sort of stem from that, specifically with themselves. But you can also get them to do so with some of your other mercenaries. And then the last one that I really hope that we get to this point, because conceptually I love it. He's basically an anti-bard. He is a bard. If you were to take the concept of a bard and place it in this world where everyone's selfish, so he basically just makes loud and annoying noises that affects everyone. So he has like bard type persistent effects that are all negative, but it hits everyone, including your characters. So that's like a concept that and it's like that you can in battle that can be advantageous. Like, if you're fighting something that is like a physical attacker and you basically nerf everybody's physical attack, and you use magic, then it doesn't really affect you. So there's like ways that you can play strategically with this character, but I would just I really want to get him in. He's one of my favorite, just like straight up NPCs in the game already, and I like to elevate him to mercenary level would be amazing.
And having like the variety of characters, as you said, is going to be a very important aspect with the different mercenaries, and that does sound funny. I mean, a guy just debuffs everyone just to do things. And as we were talking about earlier, I'm sure that's going to work on any boss encounters as well, right?
Yes, yeah. Every kind of status, every status effect works on bosses. I would say the one thing that kind of like balances that a little bit is everybody has resistances to that build up over time to some status effects. Mostly ones like sleep, and there's one called root, which is like it prevents you from performing one physical attack. You have to like eat up a turn to get rid of it, essentially. Those can be, since those if you could just cast that and in every turn, right, it would be completely broken. Mm-hmm. So instead it's like Monster Hunter style, where they kind of build a resistance to it over time. So bosses would build resistance to sleep faster than like normal enemies would, but I mean, you can still use sleep on them. Sleep is still a very effective status effect when you trigger it.
Yeah. And like we said earlier, that goes back to some of the challenges of the RPG balance of if you can just knock out the enemy or keep them permanently, their attack permanently debuff, then the fight kind of loses that muster. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that these skills can still work. Like, to that point, as you said, like if an enemy can build resistance to certain ailments, can they lose that resistance, or does it just always just like it will just keep at that same low resistance throughout the entire length of the battle?
Yeah, so it's basically like it's progressive based on how many times you have triggered the status effect. So if you trigger sleep, the first time you trigger sleep, that's gonna come pretty easily. And and I mean that's something too you can use for timing issues, right? Like if you have an enemy that's like winding up to a big hit, you want to make sure you have your sleep prepared for that moment so you can stop them from doing that. But then it's like once you do it, then it will get a little bit more difficult to get the next sleep, get a little bit more difficult, and it is progressive. So in that sense, yeah, they do keep those resistances, but it's not an immunity or anything. It's just like it's just more difficult to apply that status effect.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that sort of fits in with with most, in most encounters, how many times are you going to be able to get that off anyway, right? Like, you don't want battles to be so prolonged that you can something 20 times, right? So yeah, they do keep those resistances, but also, like, over the course of the battle, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
All right. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. So, before we kind of go into like our wrap up for the cast, Kasey, anything else you want to mention about him that we didn't discuss yet?
I mean, I think we hit a lot of the bigger points. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. Yeah.
All right, sounds good. So, with that, let's kind of to wrap things up. We'll just go over some brief like logistics stuff for people listening. So, as we said, if you're watching this right now, I will probably have this up for the Friday of the week we're recording. So that will be the 22nd. So the Kickstarter should be, I think, like 6 days out at that point. So, once again, for people listening or watching, be sure to visit and support if you would like. For you, Kasey, with or without the Kickstarter, do you have any plans or rough ideas for when him will be released on Steam?
So it would basically it depends on a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Like if we were to hit our base level of funding, I would expect it to be about a 2 to 3 year development cycle at this point, or 2 to 3 years left. Mm-hmm. The if we don't hit it, I mean, who knows, right? Like if it just means that I can't keep artists on, producing at irregular intervals. Until I could get a publisher in that time, and then that could, and then we could get done. Potentially could afford another artist, and it could get, done even more quickly. If we were to hit, if something were to happen and really spark the Kickstarter to be really successful, then yeah, it's like we could, my programmer Jason, he could work full time. Mm-hmm. If we had the money to pay him in addition to the artists. I'd be able to guarantee to work full time. We could potentially get another artist. Like, all these things could change the development cycle. If we are just totally unlucky, unable to find a publisher, and we're totally self-funded, it'll be a long time. Because that essentially means that we're going to be paying our artists commissions instead of being like, hey, you work for us essentially full time. It'll be like, maybe we can squeeze, 10 hours this week out of someone, it just depends on the funding levels. But hopefully it'll be 2 to 3 years. That's what we are aiming for.
All right. And besides Steam, are you looking at any other platforms for him?
Yeah, definitely. There's on PC and Mac and Linux. There's will definitely be on itch.io just because, unless we run into like space issues, I guess, because it could be a pretty big game. But it should be on there, and as an alternative to people who don't want Steam, we'll approach GOG and see how that goes. I can't guarantee anything. I approached them with Jimmy and it didn't work out, so I can't say for sure. But most importantly, we are 100% going to be able to port our to at least go through the process of attempting to port it to consoles. So basically, it's hard to say what the console landscape is going to be, 2-3 years from now. But the goal would be Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, whatever their current system is. We are going to try to be on. We're using Game Maker, like I said earlier, and that makes it significantly easier to port to those systems than the form of RPG Maker I used, which just straight up you can't do unless you have a lot of coding know-how.
All right. So I guess I have one final question for you, and this kind of like ties into both him and Jimmy, and then we'll wrap things up. And this, I think, goes with kind of like the tone. I think this is like kind of good like encapsulation, especially like kind of the RPG maker scene itself. As we said earlier, with games like Jimmy, Fear and Hunger, Lisa, Mori, and so on, that a lot of these games have very, again, I don't want to spoil it for Jimmy, but stories that can get very dark. And
Hmm.
there's always a challenge, I think, from a writing and storytelling perspective about how dark do you make something before it just becomes, I guess, like just like pure like nihilism in terms of the
Mm,
player. And
right.
to kind of like wrap things up for this discussion, especially as we were talking about with him, that you're on a plan where, as you said, like everyone hates you. How do you kind of like balance, like, I guess, like the amount of darkness you want in these games without it being, again, too oppressive for the player?
I don't know if that's something that I like
Mm-hmm.
have thought about specifically in writing this and trying to it's about or putting it in those terms that I have to like balance the tone
Mm-hmm.
somehow. Instead, I think it's just important to be genuine and to say something genuine, and I think that's probably the difference between just having a nihilistic game.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're making something like Postal, for instance, right? Like your goal as a designer is to be like, I want to make this the edgiest thing I can possibly think of. And I think when you do that and you like drain all of the humanity out of your game in order to do that,
Mm-hmm.
that's when you get those sort of just like edgy nihilistic games that don't really like, I mean, you don't really resonate so much with as much as it
Mm-hmm.
is like it might be like fun and like a you know maybe fun to an extent, but not something that you really are like identify with or
Mm-hmm.
anything. I think if you're approaching the writing just from like a genuine perspective, and that's that kind of goes across everything too. Like if I were making something that's like a very like a game that's very potentially sentimental, or no violence happens in it. Like if I were making that kind of thing, if I were approaching it from a really genuine place, it could still be meaningful and not saccharine. And I think it's just the same. It's the same kind of thing here. Like I can keep things really dark, but as long as like the core of it is trying to say something, I think it'll resonate with people. And I mean, I think that's what I did with or what I tried to do with Jimmy, and I think it did resonate with a lot with a it found an audience, and I think they appreciate that about it. But I think it really just comes down to just being genuine in your writing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And as you said, it is about like what is kind of like the message or what is the game trying to say with things. If it is
Mm-hmm.
just, here's horrible things happening to horrible people all the time, like there's not really like a lot of meat to that. And
Right.
I think with games like with Lisa and Fear and Hunger specifically, like they're both very dark games, but they're meant to be that way. Like there is a purpose to it beyond just, again, here's something horrible and then here's more horrible stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, players. I mean, this is maybe a tired debate or whatever, but like, I mean, I think video games are art. Like, I
Hmm.
think that there is, I mean, it doesn't mean that every video game is artistic or has like the ambition to be art. But I mean, I think video games certainly can be art, and yeah, I think that if there is something emotionally resonant inside of your game, and that's something that you really push as a developer, that's something that people will feel, and I think that they pick up on that, and I think that's a lot of the success for some of these games that just sort of like Fear and Hunger or Lisa. I mean, I think there's really like an emotional and like intellectual core to both of those
Hmm.
games.
Yep. Hmm. So, with that, to wrap things up for the cast, Casey, first off, for people watching us right now, besides, I'll include links again to the store pages for Jimmy and to the Kickstarter page for him. Any rails you would like to mention social media wise, you would like to plug?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter as Kasey Ozymy. I mostly just I almost exclusively just talk about give like news about whatever I'm working on there. Like it's not something I super use for personal purposes. So like if you just want to like keep in touch or keep up to date rather, that's like a good place to do it, at least for now. I don't know what is going to happen with Twitter, but yeah, social media is very weird right now. But yeah, so there's that. I'm also if you go to my Twitter or the Steam for either of my games, like you can find a link to the Discord, to our company Discord. And actually, if you go to starseedgames.com, you can find those links as well to everything. And yeah, the Discord is another place that I'm on most days. If you and I'll straight up talk to you if you have something to say. So that if you have any kind of whatever business thing, or you just sort of like want to know, or you just want to talk about the games that I've done, or I mean, if you need like help with your own game or something, like you can generally reach me there, and there's a community of people there that would also help you with that kind of thing.
All right, sounds good. And yeah, I'll include links to everything like that in the description down below for people watching. So, to end the cast on, do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans watching, or any final points to take us home?
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess in general, I'm just really grateful. When I put Jimmy out there, I had no real understanding of whether or not how well it would do, and it found an audience, and I mean, it didn't like blow up or anything, but it definitely found an audience of people that like really dig it, and that's been really enriching for me, and validating. That it's like that I made something and it did connect with people, and I'm really appreciative for that, and so I've seen it too with this Kickstarter, because it's like we're not getting like a lot of coverage on this. We've gotten a little bit, but most of the people that are on that Kickstarter have just been like fans, and I mean, a few of them dropped a lot of money on it. Like like if there's a $1,000 tier and 6 people have picked it up, and that is crazy to me, that they've trust they've trusted me enough based on Jimmy. I think that's, I mean, it's just really, really cool, and I'm really grateful for it, so yeah.
All right. And Kasey, I do want to wish you the best of luck for the Kickstarter as well. And like I said a few minutes ago, for the people watching, be sure to check it out if you are interested and want to get your support in, as it will be almost up by the time you're watching this right now.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for having me on. This is really interesting discussion.
Thank you again for reaching out and wanting to come on. And yeah, if you are free in the future and want to talk anything more about him or RPG design in general, I'll be happy to have you back.
Sure thing, yeah.
All right. Thank you. And again, for people watching us, if you are interested in coming on to talk about game dev, a game you worked on, or something that's upcoming in the game dev space, please reach out. Again, Twitter, X, whatever it's going to be called, emails, however you would like to reach me, I am always here. And for people watching, again, on YouTube, do the YouTubing stuff, check out my Discord and Patreon, all the books that I have, and so on. So, Kasey, with that said, I will let you go for our chat. Again, best of luck with him, and hopefully we can chat again in the future.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Thanks so much.
All right. So with that said, everybody, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until our next chat, take care.